The war in Ukraine rages on. Hundreds of Russian drones and missiles are fired over the border each night, and Kyiv continues to pay the price for Russian President Vladimir Putin's ruthless and reckless quest for power. Despite huge loss of life, devastating attacks on both sides of the border, and several rounds of supposed peace talks, the conflict shows little to no signs of ending anytime soon. It's time for something to change. It's time to destroy Russia's war chest once and for all. That's the view of Svitlana Romanko, founder and director of Razom We Stand, a Ukrainian organization that calls for a full and frank embargo of Russian fossil fuels and an end to investment in the country's oil and gas industries. This, Romanko and others argue, is the way to end the war, because without his country's economy propped up by energy exports, Putin simply would no longer have the funds necessary to keep the conflict going. He wouldn't have the money to persist with his costly recruitment drives, expensive arms production plans, and the construction of more military infrastructure. Romanko made a call for a direct attack on the Kremlin's war chest in a recent op-ed for the Kyiv Independent. She stated that she and her fellow Ukrainians are eager to see an imminent ceasefire on the ground, moving towards a state of true, just and lasting peace for the nation. However, so far, for all the talks and diplomacy, plus the vague and misleading promises of Putin, death and destruction continue to rain down across Ukraine. Romanko then pointed to Russia's intensifying aggression and recklessness, like the recent attack on Kyiv, in which the building housing the European Union's mission to Ukraine was damaged in a direct violation of the Vienna Convention. That attack also killed 8 people, including a child, providing further proof that Putin and his Kremlin cohorts have no imminent plans to end the war, despite whatever claims the Russian leader may have made during his recent meeting with US President Donald Trump in Alaska. While Trump emerged optimistic from those meetings and other world leaders hoped that peace was finally on the horizon, Russia's relentless attacks have simply continued and in many cases worsened. More people are dying, more pieces of infrastructure are being damaged and destroyed, and more carnage and chaos spread. The lesson here is clear. Talking with Putin isn't working. The Russian president knows how to trick and charm those who try to get close to him, twisting the narrative and making grand proclamations and promises he has no intention of keeping. He's repeatedly shifted the goalposts over the course of the war, saying one thing but doing another, and he evidently has little interest in sitting down with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, to thrash out the details of a genuine peace deal that suits both parties. If talks won't work, the most viable option left to end the war, according to Romanko and various other experts, is economic pressure. Specifically, pressure on Russia's oil and gas industries. These are the biggest pillars of the Russian economy, and since the war began, Russia has earned over $1 trillion, more than 938 billion euros to be precise, from fossil fuel exports, with European Union countries accounting for over 213 billion euros, or close to $250 billion. It's in large part thanks to this money that Putin has been able to afford his extraordinarily expensive invasion up to now, cranking up defense spending to massive levels in recent years. An estimated $102 billion in 2022, $109 billion in 2023, and a gigantic $149 billion in 2024. Europe and other Western nations have, however, found ways to weaken the Russian economy. Early on in the war, the first sanctions were imposed on Russian banks, businesses and oligarchs. Banks were cut off from the SWIFT international payment system, making it suddenly much harder for money to flow in and out of the country, and Russian central bank assets were frozen. Indeed, by March 1st of 2022, mere days into the invasion, an estimated $1 trillion worth of Russian assets had been frozen. Many major international companies then left the Russian market, and Ukraine's allies around the world have maintained pressure over time, introducing wave after wave of fresh sanctions and economic punishments, all aimed at making it much harder for the Kremlin to keep its campaign going. In December 2022, for example, Russia introduced a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian crude oil, following up with a wave of EU sanctions that prohibited the purchase, import, or transfer of crude or refined products, leading to a dramatic decline in the amount of oil entering Europe from Russia. Through 2023 and 2024, more sanctions followed, focusing on a range of products and trade restrictions, as well as price caps on certain products like diesel, gasoline, and fuel oil. Thousands upon thousands of sanctions rolled out over this period, and more have followed in 2025. May 20 of this year, for example, saw the 17th EU sanctions package hit Russia, targeting dozens of powerful individuals and entities and lowering the price of crude oil even further. The 18th package came soon after, in July, with new sanctions imposed on the energy and banking sectors, like banning imports of certain refined products, cutting off transactions with multiple Russian banks, and blocking the Nord Stream pipeline. The G7 nations have also found ways to turn Russia's frozen assets against it, launching the ERA Loans for Ukraine initiative, which essentially involves taking the net profits from Russian assets to fund Ukrainian defense spending, allowing the country to splash the Kremlin's cash and buy new weapons and defenses. Billions of dollars have already been sent to Ukraine through this initiative, with more on the way. All of this has taken a toll and proven effective to varying levels, and the Russian economy, despite Putin's proclamations to the contrary, has really started to suffer, especially in 2025. After much boasting and bravado in the past, even the country's top financial leaders have recently sounded the alarm about an impending recession and major economic crisis if military spending continues at its current rate. At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June, for example, Russia's Minister for Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, stated that the country was on the brink of recession. Elvira Nabiullina, head of the Russian Central Bank, agreed, calling for immediate action to mitigate the risk of a serious and long-lasting crisis. We grew for 2 years at a fairly high pace because unused resources were activated. We need to understand that many of those resources have truly been exhausted. More recently, in early August, the Russian Central Bank released an updated financial forecast for the remainder of 2025, estimating that Russia may enter a state of zero economic growth by the end of the year. Russia's National Wealth Fund has also seen some sharp declines over the course of the conflict so far. It was worth $135 billion back before the war began, but dropped to just $35 billion by May of this year. There are also problems with the value of the Russian ruble, plus a major labor crisis due to a shortage of workers, since so many people have either been drafted or joined the war effort, with more than 1 million killed or injured in the process. The costs of the war are also trickling down to the general public, with Russian families now forced to pay close to twice as much for simple everyday groceries and essentials, compared to what they were paying just a few years ago. In short, the Russian economy is spiraling, and it's due to a mixture of factors, but mainly the cost of the war itself and the impact of Western sanctions. But still, the conflict rages on. Still, the Kremlin finds a way to recruit tens of thousands of new soldiers each month, create and launch hundreds of drones and missiles into Ukraine each day, build new pieces of military infrastructure, and pile the pressure onto its opponents along the front lines. Even Putin has been forced to admit that his economy can't keep up with the pace of military spending, as the Russian president recently announced a cut in the defense budget for 2026. But it's still not enough to force him to the negotiating table to work out the details of a ceasefire or order the Russian forces to retreat from Ukraine. The war shows little sign of ending, and a big reason for that is because, in spite of many waves of European sanctions and other economic punishments from the US and other nations across the globe, Russia's biggest industry, energy, is still running relatively effectively. Oil and gas are still flowing, and many countries have no qualms about investing in those resources, even if the money is used to fuel the war. China, for example, continues to invest heavily in Russian coal and crude oil, and has in fact increased its reliance on Russian resources since the war began. India is another major investor. Before the war began, it wasn't considered a major investor in Russian energy, but has, like China, increased its spending over the last few years. Turkey and Brazil are other big buyers, and the EU too, in spite of its sanctions and restrictions, remains the largest purchaser of pipeline gas and liquefied natural gas (LNG) from Russia. This all gives Russia a valuable and much needed lifeline to hold on to. And the fact that Putin recently enjoyed a very friendly and much publicized meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping suggests that the trade relationships between Russia, India and China are only set to strengthen in the months to come. That could give the Kremlin the extra investment it needs to not only maintain the war effort, but perhaps even to intensify it. This is why Ukraine's allies, especially those in Europe, need to up the ante. Now is the time, according to Romanko, to hit Russia harder than ever before, with a bigger, bolder and more damaging sanctions plan targeted directly at the energy sector. As Romanko notes, the right kinds of sanctions can and do have a big impact on Russia. According to the United Kingdom's Foreign Office, sanctions have so far taken approximately $450 billion in war funds away from Russia, including a whopping $140 billion of lost oil tax revenues. The country's fuel industry has been forced to make costly adjustments, taking longer and more expensive routes to transport resources where they're needed, and shadow fleet tankers have been blacklisted, making it even more difficult for the oil and gas industries to operate. Moscow's foreign reserves are slowly but surely shrinking too. The pressure is piling up, but it's not quite enough to tip the scales of the war just yet. For that, Romanko says, Europe has been willing to push its sanctions even further. Europe's next sanctions package must finally strike at the heart of Putin's war chest. Europe cannot keep tinkering around the edges. A full embargo on Russian fossil fuels is long overdue, and the oil price cap should be slashed to $20 to $25 per barrel, the level that would actually hurt Moscow rather than help it. She goes further, urging Europe to sever support for Russia's LNG projects, while also calling on the US to follow up with secondary sanctions not just on Russia itself, but the countries that continue to support it. Equally urgent is cutting off Russia's prize LNG projects, including Arctic LNG 2, one of Putin's personal crown jewels. The Russian shadow fleet of tankers must be dismantled through strict enforcement of maritime transparency, ownership disclosure, and oversight of insurers and flag states. And sanctions must be aligned across the Atlantic, with the EU and the UK working with the US in imposing tough secondary measures on Russia's biggest energy customers. Europe also needs to look at its own fossil fuel dependency. Replacing Russian LNG with fossil fuels from other autocratic regimes would mean repeating the same dangerous mistakes of the past. Reliance on US LNG should also be carefully weighed, particularly with an unpredictable administration in Washington. These dramatic shifts in sanction policy would be likely to have a sizable impact on the war moving forward, because ultimately every war effort comes down to money. Countries cannot keep throwing soldiers, weapons and vehicles at their enemies indefinitely. It all comes at a cost, and the bill gets bigger the longer the conflict continues. Putin has proven he doesn't care all that much about the human cost of his war. Hundreds of thousands of his countrymen have lost their lives and countless more injured, with the Russian president recently stating that all of them were wounded or killed for a cause. Nor does he seem to care too much about the material cost, with Russia having lost exceptional amounts of tanks, armoured vehicles, aircraft, air defences, radar systems and other hardware. But one thing that Putin does seem to care about is cash, because cash is directly connected with power, and power is what drives Putin. He's obsessed with it and desperate to claim as much as he can, which is part of the reason why he's been working closely with his intelligence agency, the FSB, in recent times to purge generals and other figures of authority that may pose a threat to his leadership or have valuable assets he can take for himself. Striking the economy is the best way to hit Putin where it hurts most. That's why Ukraine has been so smart and selective in its own attacks on Russian soil or occupied territories. It's repeatedly used its drones and missiles to strike the kinds of targets that cost a lot of money to rebuild or repair, or those that cause the most economic loss and hardship for the Kremlin. Targets like oil refineries, fuel depots, production plants and so on. It's all about making life harder and costlier for Russia, because the less money it has, the harder it is to buy missiles, make drones and launch attacks. Russia, meanwhile, clearly intends to keep up its war of attrition by any means necessary, sending drone after drone, missile after missile, and one assault group after another over the border and into Ukraine, with the intent of wearing down the country's resolve, breaking through its defensive lines, and taking land one bit at a time. Even though many experts say that it would take another 4 to 5 years for Russia simply to capture the contested territories it's already tried to annex, as well as almost 2 million more casualties, plus decades more to take over Ukraine in its entirety, none of that seems to faze Putin. Most likely because he believes that Western sanctions will never be enough to truly unravel his economy, and that he can continue getting away with whatever he wants, with the financial might of countries like China and India to prop him up. Europe has the power to change all that, but there are fears that the next wave of European sanctions, the 19th wave in total, may not be sufficient. Speaking under cover of anonymity, European diplomats have reportedly revealed that the new sanctions will not include any fresh restrictions on the huge energy sales that largely fuel the war. They'll instead focus on shadow fleet vessels and companies that are making it easier for Russia to flout existing rules and restrictions. If true, this simply isn't enough to have any major impact on the Kremlin. For that, Romanko says, Europe needs to be bold. True energy security will never come from trading one dependency for another. It will come from breaking free of fossil fuels altogether. That means massively investing in cheaper renewables and prioritizing energy efficiency over destructive fossil infrastructure. The EU has made remarkable progress in reducing its dependence on Russian energy, but this is not the time to slow down. Every euro denied to Russia's treasury is a missile that cannot be built, a drone that cannot be launched, a life in Ukraine that can be spared. Putin is counting on Europe's hesitation and Trump's vanity. He's exploiting Washington's theatrics to buy time on the battlefield. Europe cannot afford to wait. By strengthening sanctions now and cutting off the fossil cash that fuels Russia's war, the EU can demonstrate that its commitment to Ukraine is not only about words, but about action. A united, determined Europe can close the loopholes, dry up Putin's war chest, and bring closer the day when peace is built on justice, accountability, and security. That's the only kind of peace Ukrainians can accept, and the only kind of peace Europe should stand for. It remains to be seen if the EU will heed this Ukrainian call for deeper and stronger action, or if the US will issue a response of its own, perhaps imposing long-discussed tariffs and sanctions on the many key trading partners of Russia, giving Putin no other option but to, at long last, accept that his illegal invasion is utterly unsustainable. One thing is clear. Talking to Putin appears to be pointless. Multiple discussions have now taken place, but the world appears no closer to peace than it was this time last year. But while Putin may be able to ignore words, he can't ignore actions, especially actions that plunge his country ever deeper into economic strife and turmoil. The time may finally be right for Ukraine's allies to deal the knockout blow to Russia's war chest and bring this bloody war to its end. Now, learn more about the pile of problems mounting up on Putin's desk in our recent in-depth look at how Russia's summer offensive has completely failed to produce the kind of results the Kremlin had hoped for. Or for a view of how the war is going from Ukraine's perspective, enjoy our detailed breakdown of how the country has innovated and excelled to transform its missile industry over the last few years, producing new and powerful weapons that could be enough to turn the tide of battle. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our channel too, to stay informed and up to date on all major events and recent developments from the front lines of Ukraine and beyond.